Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today for this Double Eyes webinar on Libya. This event is the latest installment in a series of conflict briefings that the Conflict Security and Development team organize each month. I am Flore Berger, a research analyst at IIS, monitoring security and political developments in the Sahel. I'm delighted to share this discussion today with two great speakers who will share their insights with us today. So we will speak about Libya, looking at what is going on at the moment with the escalation of tensions between Egypt and Turkey. As you know, this webinar is very timely, and that's why we have so many attendees, which is really great. But we also look at the internal dynamics within the LNA and GNA, their partition, etc., and how this impacts the security dynamics. So to speak today, we have Umberto Profazio, a Maghreb analyst for the NATO Defense College Foundation. Previously, he was working with us at IIS as the Libya analyst for the CSDP team. He regularly publishes on issues such as political development, security, and terrorism in the Middle East and North Africa region. The second speaker is Jalel Harchaoui, a research fellow in the Conflict Research Unit of the Klingendahl Institute based in The Hague. His work focuses on Libya, and in particular the country's security landscape and political economy. Thanks for taking the time to join this conversation today. And just a few remarks before we start. So we have about an hour for this webinar. And we will begin with half an hour of discussion, after which we'll have 30 minutes left to take questions from the audience. To ask your question, please use Zoom's Q&A feature to ask any questions you'd like. And if they're directed at a specific speaker, please mention it. Otherwise, we'll take them as they come and we'll do our best to address as many as possible. So Umberto, if we can start with you. We're actually waiting for Jalel to join, so hopefully he'll be there in a few minutes. So Umberto, if we can start with you. We will talk a bit later on about the strategic dimension of the conflict and the international actors involved there, but I would like first to look at the reality on the ground with much of the fighting being carried out by local militias. So can you tell us a bit about the composition of the LNA and the GNA and how cohesive are these groups? Umberto, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Flore. I would also like to thank the IIS for the invitation to this very timely conflict briefing on Libya. I will try to give some background to this great and middle powers competition in Libya, explaining why Libya provided such a fertile ground for foreign interferences and what would be the risk for the country in the months and years to come. First of all, we must acknowledge the risk that what has been considered as a proxy war is on the edge of transforming into direct military confrontation between rival powers. The multiplication of the red lines is a direct consequence of the progressive internationalizations of the war, and is making it more intractable. For this reason, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently warned about the unprecedented levels of foreign interferences in Libya. But to understand the prevailing international dimension over local dynamics of the conflict, we need a more appropriate explanation. The process of fragmentation of Libya that started since 2011 and worsened considerably in the second phase of the civil war in 2014 has led to a power vacuum that the transitional authorities had been unable to address. The April 2019 attack on Tripoli, which can be described as the start of the third phase of the civil war, clearly represented an attempt by General Haftar to seize power by force, but at the same time it increased the regional divide and the duality between the east and the west of the country. The offensive was supposed to be the natural prosecution of the Operation Dignity, but at the same time it provided the main armed groups in Tripolitania with a glue to join forces and face a common threat. The counteroffensive saw the participation of the main militias from Misrata, Tripoli, and Zintan. And as described in the most recent edition of the Armed Conflict Survey published by the IISS, this alliance is a first serious attempt by the GNA, the authorities in Tripoli, of establishing its own army, what has been described as the Libyan armed forces. It is important to note that contrary to the centrifugal forces that caused the fragmentation of Libya after 2011, the Libyan armed forces is moving in the opposite direction and is joining the LNA in the category of the centripetal forces that aim at recomposing the divided social fabric of the country around a distinctive national or nationalistic project. At the same time, it is quite clear that this attempt is purely reactionary to the authoritarian project of General Haftar, and it also risks being instrumental in maintaining the status quo in Tripoli, of which the main militias in the capital has been so far the main beneficiary. We know that the Libyan armed forces suffers from the differences between the armed groups that compose them, and it can be said that its homogeneity is directly proportional to Haftar's threat. But at the same time, the role played by the militia cartel in Tripoli in the predatory economy is the major fault line around which runs the divide in Tripolitania. The control of the main economic and financial centers has given some groups, some armed groups, which can be described as insiders, with a source of revenue, from which other groups that can be described as outsiders have been excluded. The 2019 attack on Tripoli saw the recomposition of this fracture and paved the way for a grand coalition in which we saw a major involvement of the militias from Misrata and Zintan. Nevertheless, we also must acknowledge that this alliance can be described as provisional and highly exposed to the shifting sands in Libya, whose dynamics runs along the major tribal fault lines that reactivated after 2011. The high cohesion of the militias in Misrata, which are considered the most powerful in Libya, have been crucial for the defense of Tripoli. Nevertheless, the turbulent period following the establishment of the GNA has left some scores to settle in the city. While some armed groups immediately threw their support to the GNA, other groups in Misrata maintained an hostile stance towards it. And the links between some of these groups with the Islamist militias and have raised suspicions to proximity to the Muslim Brotherhood and to its Libyan branch, which the Justice and Construction Party is the main political reference. Even though the cooperation between the Muslim Brotherhood and some extremist and radical groups have emerged from time to time, there are still some doubts about the real weight of the group in the Libyan political landscape, as well as its extent of influence over the GNA. And some groups have also maintained an hostile stance and were highly critical of the GNA. In the case of a plausible reconfiguration of the power relations in Tripoli, it is also important to note that much will depend on the relations between these groups and the local Salafist groups. The diffusion of the Madgalist doctrine is anyway a cross-cutting issue, because many Madgalist groups are also affiliated to the LNA. Just an example is the 604 Brigade based in Sirte, that in January was responsible for the shifting of alliance that allowed the LNA to enter the city. And these developments show how the prevalence of the cooptation model as a modus operandi of General Haftar was advances have been made more through local agreements with the armed groups than through military successes. For these reasons, there are some doubts about the real military capability of the LNA, which were highlighted by the difficulties in taking control of Benghazi and Derna, for example, but also in the recent route in Tripoli. But also there are some doubts about its internal cohesion, which makes it more close to the horizontal model of the Libyan armed forces than to a professional army with a clear chain of command, like portrayed by some biased propaganda sources. The estimates of 25,000 fighters in the LNA ranks obviously include some battalions, which are integral part of the LNA, more according to a nepotistic model than to meritocracy. Nevertheless, there are a number, 18,000 auxiliary militias, which includes not only the paramilitary corps, like the Petroleum Facilities Guards, but also tribal militias, mercenaries, and non-state, foreign non-state armed groups. The outsourcing, frankly, the outsourcing of specific tasks and military operations to foreign mercenaries and non-state armed groups is common practice in both camps, and it highlights the internationalizations of the conflict that we spoke before. The internationalizations also risk undermining the reconciliation process among the Libyan actors, making the UN attempts to mediate and resolve the crisis subordinate to direct and informal agreements between rival regional powers. And in this context, lacking a clear and agreed upon multilateral framework to manage and de-escalate the crisis, the conflict is gradually slipping away from the hands of the Libyans to be driven by dynamics of pure power politics. That is the main risk that I perceive. The unpredictable results risk extending the conflict further and pushing Libya towards a dangerous partition.
Thank you, Umberto. And yeah, it's perfect. Actually, for the next question that is going to answer. So, Jalel, can you bring us up to speed with the recent developments that we've seen in Libya, and in particular with Turkey and Egypt? Can you tell us if we're expecting Egypt to intervene in the coming days or weeks, and if it does, with what strategy is Egypt going to do that?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm very glad to be here. Yes, Flor, the answer is, I would say yes, technically. Are we going to see some form of an official military intervention on the part of Egypt following the parliament's vote a couple of days ago? The answer is yes, but this is not a very informative answer on my part, and the mode of action and the way it's going to be unfolded is really going to make all the difference. I think the best way for me to describe the current situation is maybe to start with a flashback, not too long ago, just 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks ago, it was in the immediate wake of this double whammy. The LNA, the armed coalition of Haftar, had to withdraw from Tripoli, following the very deliberate, very politically orchestrated withdrawal of the Russian mercenaries, which I think in itself is a historic event. It happened on the 22nd of May. And by the 4th of June, we could see that most of the logistical coordination work and in terms of maintaining the offensive effort was effectively being done by Russia, because the LNA couldn't hold. And it collapsed in Tripoli on the 4th, and by the 5th, it had to flee Tarhuna, not only on its own, but also with the Kaniat, this infamous big brigade that was holding Tarhuna. And right after this, what we saw was basically a series of very arrogant, I would say, almost announcements and declarations on the part of both the Tripoli government and Ankara. The Tripoli government said, the Minister of the Interior said, Gardabiya, the air base of Sirte, will never be Russian. We are going to recover Sirte. We are going to recover Jufra. And Erdogan, on a TV interview, even said, we want the oil croissant. And I think we should believe him when he says that. He really would like to have control over the oil croissant, because that's the only way for the maritime dimension, which is the primary motivation, not the only one, the primary motivation behind the decision to intervene so fully in Libya on the part of Turkey is to be able to use that as an argument to enforce the corridor, the exclusive economic zone on the water, the maritime accord. And without, if Turkey doesn't control the oil croissant, then you always have a very distinct possibility, a chance that the UAE would do with Eastern Libya what it's already doing in South Yemen, which is to engineer a form of partition, because it's actually rational on the part of the UAE to make sure that Turkey's entire project never works. And if you achieve a viability, an economic viability in Cyrenaica, then you have good reason to think that you're really turning Turkey's dream into a nightmare. So we saw all of this, and we saw also a battle in Sirte. People forget about this. The GNA forces, in a very disorganized way, entered a good portion of the city. They started using mortar shells, and a lot of them got killed. And we saw contact with the enemy, followed within a couple of days by a withdrawal. Today, the atmosphere is completely different. We clearly we hear less and less noise coming out of Ankara, even less coming out of Tripoli. We see a dynamic where any serious decision with regard to Sirte or Jufra is obviously going to be taken by Ankara. Zero power on the part of the Libyans. I could say the same about the East. Zero power on the part of Haftar and his immediate circle. And everything is kind of slowing down. And there was effectively a very persuasive deterrence device that was installed in Sirte. I'm referring to the snipers, I'm referring to the air defense systems, I'm of course underscoring the importance of the hundreds and hundreds of anti-personnel mines installed. And all of that work, the vast majority of it, was done not by Egypt. It was done by this symbiotic combination, this kind of weird creature. Big part of it is Wagner, which itself is a hybrid. It's not a commercial business 100%, and it's not the Kremlin, it's not the Russian state, it's somewhere in between, working very closely with the UAE, providing, the UAE earlier this year gave its 2 bases to the Russian mercenaries. I'm referring to Al-Khadam, Benghazi, and of course Jufra itself. And this kind of defensive work, because now Turkey is effectively trying to adopt the posture of an aggressor for the first time since it started its intervention. And whatever has been done on the LNA side seems to be working. So a big slowdown of the conflict, huge hesitation now on the part of Ankara. Maybe it will find a trick to revive the whole thing, but maybe not, right? And so effectively, in that framework, the parliament's vote, the Cairo decision to announce a very possible intervention has become almost just a cherry on the pie. It's not the pie. And it does make a difference. I'm not being derogatory here. I think Egypt has, in addition to the pressure we can easily imagine on the part of the Gulf states, it has very legitimate concerns, and it could address that by conducting a form of military intervention that would see it guarantee, through physical presence, the security of this sliver of land along the border on the Libyan side. That kind of presence would also give it more control over what kind of leadership should now exist on top of the LNA, whether it should be called the LNA or should it be changed. In those kinds of moments of transition, it's better to be physically there and really be in control, and not necessarily have to go and conduct a land army thrust into CERT. So it's kind of working out, and I think that's where we stand. If everything has been slowed down in a major way, then we realize that Turkey is no longer as self-confident as it was 7 weeks ago, and it has serious problems because it did the military part, but to achieve victory, you need to do much more than just the military stuff. You need to look after the diplomatic recognition, look after security sector reform in the West, who controls the central bank. Can we make the current central bank survive? Because Turkey really needs to extract money out of that entity. What do you do with, in terms of reviving the oil industry that has been blockaded since mid-January this year? There's a lot of non-military issues. And in that realm, the UAE is brilliant. As opposed to the conventional military stuff. So that's basically where we stand now.
Thank you for this. And can I ask you to continue a bit on that question and expand a bit on other foreign powers or other actors involved? And here I'm thinking, you already mentioned the UAE, but what is France or Russia thinking about this potential intervention?
Yeah, Russia is basically cultivating and maintaining and entertaining two kinds of bilateral partnerships. One has never been filled with any kind of enthusiasm for Haftar, but of course Russia since 2012 has clearly decided to make a strong long-term comeback across the entire Middle East, North Africa region. When you do that, you cannot afford to be on the opposite side compared to Gulf states as major as the UAE or Saudi Arabia. So there's definitely a commitment to listen to them, work with them, and not necessarily be listened to. And there's one thing that Russia has understood about the UAE is that the UAE is not in the business of listening to anybody. And so that explains why a lot of that interaction goes through this entity that I was referring to, Wagner. If you need something, obviously your proxies are weak. We're not able to collect fresh mercenaries out of the new government in Sudan, and you have this chronic weakness, which Umberto was eloquently referring to, then we can fill the gap technically, and it's not a commitment on the part of the Russian state. So this is the kind of relationship that has really, has looked ugly from our perspective, but from the perspective of the Kremlin itself, it has been a good deal because, as you just have to sit back and realize that the political influence of the Kremlin over the political affairs inside Libya, particularly in the east, has only been increasing. We should always remember that on the 27th of April, Haftar went on TV and decided to announce a new coup. The next day, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, expressed his disapproval. This was completely unthinkable a year ago. And the reason Russia keeps garnering more and more influence and more political sway over Libyan affairs is through those punctual, short-term services that it renders, not directly as a state, but through intermediaries. And at the same time, Russia is not in full enmity versus Turkey. It knows that its primary objective is to undermine the liberal democratic institutions like NATO and the EU and all these things, and never burning bridges with Turkey achieves that. So very often here in Paris, you hear of Russia as the antidote against Turkey. It's not the antidote against Turkey because it's not really the enemy of Turkey. Of course, it's not a friend, obviously, but it's in that grayish area, a lot of which is designed specifically to always contradict cohesiveness within the EU or cohesiveness within NATO. So Russia is obviously, cold-hearted, very lucid, using cynicism in a very talented way. And I would not say all those positive things. It's not as skillful on the part of Paris. Paris is much more influenced by it's very close, almost unconditional friendship with the UAE, which can be understood if you look at it from an Africa wide perspective. It's completely understandable why France feels alone vis-a-vis the United States, why it feels alone vis-a-vis Britain and Germany, and why it's so committed to preserving this friendship with the UAE when it comes to security matters. But the bottom line is that there's like almost a philosophical influence on the part of the UAE, and we see France that's now on the same side as effectively the UAE and the same side as Russia. And that involves acceptance of the Russian mercenaries, acceptance of the Syrian mercenaries. It's kind of bizarre to see France in that camp, but that's the reality now. Is France going to collect the dividends of all this? Not clear. So far, it has not been successful. But one thing is certain, is that it's not changing its way of thinking. And I think, as I was saying earlier, the UAE now being in charge of this new defensive mission is going to do better than when it was on the offensive. The offensive was never really a French idea or an Emirati idea. They just happened to support it because they thought that, hey, why not? We could give it a shot. It turned out to be a 14-month long war with a lot of damage, but it wasn't really a project that was deliberate on the part of those states. Haftar is going to be history very soon, if it's not already the case in terms of political influence. I would argue that he has zero influence. He cannot even decide the color of the wallpaper. But I think France is now beginning a new phase, closely with this idea of a tight partnership with not just the UAE, but also acceptance with this idea of a rapprochement with Russia. So I think there's no conclusion here, and certainly not one that is favorable to Turkey.
Thank you, Jalel, for that. So we've come already to the end of the first half an hour of this webinar. So please, as I said, if you have any questions, ask it through the Q&A feature. And before, because I am going to use my privilege chair of this event, I'm going to ask the first question. So it's something we haven't mentioned it before, but I would like to know, ask you, maybe Umberto to start, but you can both, of course, answer that question. But what is the state of Islamist groups in Libya, and how big of a threat are they posing? And also, if one of you can talk particularly about, given the rival governments and the infighting between militias and the divide, what kind of ability does the government have to combat violent extremism? So Umberto, if you can start, and then maybe Jalel, you can chip in also with some of your insights.
Thank you, Flor. If we compare the state in which the Islamic State is in Libya now with a couple of years ago, it is clear that the group has been considerably weakened. There have been several airstrikes against ISIS, especially in the south of the country, where most of the fighters moved. There was a series of airstrikes in September 2019 that were confirmed by the US Africa Command. And a few weeks later, I remember there was an African official's interview that said that there were a bit more than 100 ISIS fighters in Libya. I think this is a very conservative figure, given the fact that most of the times the lines, the marketing lines between ISIS and other terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb that has a presence in southwestern Libya are really blurred. But at the same time, I think that the fact that the southern part of Libya is actually a bit problematic given the lack of services, power outages, and the increasing impact that the coronavirus, the COVID-19 virus is having, especially in the south, in Sabah and in other areas, can create the premises for a resurgence of terrorist groups, especially considering the crisis in the wide area of the Sahel. Given the second question was about the capability of the two main groups of fighting the terrorism, I think that for the time being, both of them have had some difficulties. But given the fact that these groups have been considerably weakened, there have been not so many attacks against symbolic institutions like in 2017, 2018. But I expect a resurgence of these terrorist attacks in the coming months if the conflict is gonna worsen. Especially considering that the Islamic State, in particular, has always profited from the crisis in the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you, Jalel. Do you want to add anything to what Umberto said? Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I would just simply compliment because I obviously agree with everything that Umberto has said. I would just add one little consideration is the fact that if Daesh over the last several months has been able to gather a little bit of an additional strength and regroup, and it has no incentive to conduct an attack, and that bothers me a lot because it means that there's no observable, not necessarily any observable clues to any kind of strengthening if a strengthening is actually happening. For two reasons, primarily. First of all, there's a very high degree of confusion. And so in terms of bang for your buck, in terms of conducting an attack and conveying a psychological or ideological message, it cannot be efficient in this kind of environment. So typically they prefer exactly what Umberto was saying, an environment like 2017 or 2018, where things were quieter. People were talking about elections, which are perceived as a symbol of a Western type kind of tradition. So here, if I were a cell, let's say a dormant cell in Tripoli or whatever else, and I'm ISIS, I would wait. And the other thing also that goes in the same direction of waiting for a bigger smash later on is that this knowledge, the knowledge that Daesh is doing fantastic, not too far from there in the Sahel. So if you take these things combined, you have every reason to just take your sweet time and gather strength and wait for the Libyans to have the illusion that they achieved some kind of local peace and start talking about what is typically considered as an ideological nemesis of what Daesh is trying to be. In terms of, that's what I would call in general security sector reform under the Turks' supervision. The Turks have been talking about this, and I think we are seeing signs that new brigades are being announced, and there's this very ambitious plan to really kind of refurbish the security landscape in the Tripoli area mostly. I think that a lot of it is genuine, and a lot of it also is both naive in the sense that I think there's a little bit of favoritism that is inevitable on the part of Turkey, which will create jealousies and rivalries that will be revived, and that could easily trigger incidents between armed groups affiliated with the GNA officially. That will surprise a lot of people, not just in Tripoli itself, but also in the periphery. And the other thing also is in terms of the Turks, they, are they deeply committed to really fighting any kind of terrorist threat as soon as possible, or are they maybe overstretched, or maybe they don't have an immediate incentive to achieve peace? Because if the big slowdown that I was describing earlier does take place, then you don't necessarily have all the incentives in the world in terms of delivering a beautiful peace, because that also means that you're useless now. So at least subconsciously, you could have a conflict of interest. The other thing that I wanted to say is that people tend to forget this, but when I speak with Western officials, usually, even including countries that prefer the LNA, when it comes to counterterrorism, the GNA does, technically speaking, a better job. They're quicker on their feet. They do follow up. They have more clarity into whatever they have in their prisons, relatively speaking. I'm not saying it's transparent. So I would expect now that the offensive of Haftar has been crushed, now that Haftar is basically in his final days, at least politically, I'm not saying as a person, we'll see more initiatives trying to break the monopoly of Turkey. We would see typically not only Italy, but also France reviving their counterterrorism dialogue that used to exist before April 2019 and even survived partially during the war. We'll see a big comeback of this. And I think instead of making it just shallow or symbolic, I think all diplomats should really take advantage of that opportunity to make it substantive, because it's one way among others to actually promote a certain authenticity in the diplomatic relations between typically Paris and Tripoli, and that is valuable. Not leave Turkey alone and not treat it as a protectorate. It's still open, and the CT is a great door to kind of revive the relationships.
Thank you. So yeah, we have quite a lot of questions coming in, so I'm gonna try to take them in an efficient way. The first one I think is interesting is a question about the current military scenario and situation that we have been discussing, and how this will affect the UN facilitated political dialogue, as well as other international processes, because yeah, there are quite a few on Libya. So Umberto, maybe can you start with this? What we see today, how is this affecting mediation, negotiations, and political dialogues?
Yes, I think that the UN is actually paralyzed. I've recently listened to the former UN Special Representative, the Secretary General, Ghassan Salameh, saying that we are heading towards a deregulated world in which multilateralism is gradually failing. The fact that the UN Security Council has been unable since he resigned to name a new UN envoy to Libya is a starking example of how the multilateralism is in fact failing. At the same time, what I was saying before about the increasing resurgence of the power politics, that is like a concept of centuries ago, is gradually resurgent. And the fact that Russia and Turkey are currently in the driving seat also speaks volumes about the fact that multilateral institutions like the EU or NATO at the same time are being tested continuously by the fact that these two powers gradually gained a foothold in Libya and are driving the peace process.
Thank you. Would you like anything to that?
Yeah, I would like to add maybe something slightly less pessimistic than what Umberto is saying. I mean, obviously I agree, but I would say that, it depends on how you look at it, because if the UN, I think that diplomacy in general, international diplomacy attached to Libya has been distorted by this 14 or 15-month suspense. of looking at Libya as a very binary divide, and we're completely dominated by this priority of trying to stop the offensive. You know, the LNA is on the outskirts of Tripoli, it's killing civilians. How do we stop that? It's Camp A attacking Camp B. And so it's very simple, clear front line, and how do you stop this? And all kinds of states, of course, have all the incentives in the world to undermine a genuine UN effort. So if we continue looking at this and, like, let's say, but be impressed by the headlines coming out of Cairo, then of course we remain in the same mentality and say, how could we stop, you know, a possible clash between Egypt and Turkey? How do we do that? There's another way of looking at it, is to kind of, you know, stick with that assumption of a big slowdown, and remember that there's a lot of fault lines within the West and a lot of fault lines within the East. And in general, if this suspense that I was referring to, this pressure of trying to stop a big, simple war by next Thursday, if that pressure is taken away, then you realize that you can speak and broach topics like the same old ones, like the economic track, local peace initiatives, how to revive the, you know, how to refurbish the central bank system by trying to avoid partition. All these things, if we approach them without any sense of urgency and with a acute knowledge and awareness of the local divides, then I think that the UN with its team could redeploy in a different way and basically gets back to things that it knows how to do, more than stopping, you know, clash of giants. You know, I think, you know, in terms of allocating the resources in a slightly different way, I would tend to be hopeful. I just wanted to kind of add this positive note.
Thank you. I think the next question, so there are quite a few on the same topic, which is also of particular interest to me. So it's about the Sahel. And so can we expect any spillover of great power competition in the Sahel? And this person asking particularly what type of action from Turkey in the Sahel, but also more generally how the situation in Libya is impacting the Sahel. So maybe Jalel, you can start, and then Umberto, you can chip in also.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with Turkey, I personally think that France has no leg to stand on when it comes to criticizing Turkey within the northwest of Libya, because the actor that France has been deeply supportive of, at least diplomatically, was the one that was, you know, technically in the position of the aggressor, the one, you know, shooting mortar shells and grad rockets towards obviously residential areas and so on and so forth. But now, you know, that being said, I think that France is completely being logical by seeing Turkey as an adversary in other territories. And I think that Turkey's ambitions are real when it comes to now that the northwest of Libya has been secured, to start, you know, looking at the south, especially if this axis between Sirte and Jufra is being defended and enforced in a very compelling way by the actors we mentioned earlier. So then you would need to obviously go to the south to achieve some kind of economic viability, because right now Sharara, this huge, this mega oil field located in the Fezzan is basically blockaded by Haftar affiliated actors, including the influence of Russian mercenaries. So you would definitely have the temptation to start looking south. And we know from before that Africa in general, and including the Sahel, that all these things matter. Those are ambitions that are very real from a Turkish perspective. Turkey remains a manufacturing powerhouse. It needs to expand its sphere of influence. It's more agile commercially. It has all the incentives in the world to see the whole African continent as an opportunity over the next 15 or 30 years. So it will begin immediately. We see this kind of ambition and aggressiveness. And I think it will start by looking at it as doing the opposite of what France does. I mean, I don't think it's unjustified paranoia when it comes to that particular area. starting with Niger, Chad, and you take it from there. And we know that Turkey is already very close to Nigeria and other countries. So this is logical, and it will happen, and it will happen sooner than later. In terms of the Fezzan itself, I would tend to say that Haftar handled it very, very poorly at the beginning when he moved into the Fezzan in mid-January 2019. And then it just was so horrible that he basically changed tacks. And the other methodology that he used, starting in, I would say, September, October 2019, was a little bit more diplomatic, more inclusive. And now we are basically in a state of flux. So I do expect violence to be played out in the Fezzan when it comes to controlling, for example, the oil fields.
Okay. Umberto, you have anything to add?
Yes, we'd like some points about the Fezzan. I'm not an expert on Sahel, but about the Fezzan and the risk that the instability of Libya could also affect neighboring countries. We have seen it before. We have seen it last year, especially when the movement of some rebel forces from Chad led to French airstrikes in northern Chad. So I think that every kind of development in the Fezzan, especially if there is increasing instability, if there is another military campaign by the GNA to take over the Fezzan, or if there is any resistance by the LNA, could also have some repercussion in the deep south and could cause some troubles, especially considering the number of foreign non-state armed groups, especially Chadian opposition groups that are supporting both the GNA and the LNA. And this is increasingly linked to the number of foreign mercenaries that have been recruited by the two camps in the recent months and years, and the likely scenario of when the conflict is settled and these mercenaries and armed groups come back to their home country.
Okay, Umberto, if we can just continue with you, but I think there's an interesting question about the funding of these different militias. Is it predominantly through taxation within the territories, or is it also about criminal economies? Does it play a role? And do they get funds from foreign states backers? So Umberto, if we can start with you.
Well, most of these groups have been responsible for the lack of rule of law in the Fezzan, especially through kidnapping. And I think I remember that some of the Turkish companies that were operating in the Fezzan were also affected by this kidnapping. So most of these foreign non-state armed groups also resorted to kind of taxation, of course. But I think that the robberies and the kidnappings were the main source of revenue. Of course, there is also the payment by the two camps, and in this case, there have been some reports linking the money coming from several Gulf states that were used to pay the recruitment of mercenaries and militias in southern Libya.
Thanks. Jalel, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, Umberto is very correct to say that the links, the financial links at least with the GNA were never severed. They were never cut off after Haftar showed up. The GNA historically had been, had been neglecting the area when it comes to, shipping the proper amount of banknotes. You know that there's a shortage in terms of banknotes throughout Libya, and particularly in remote places like the Fezzan. It was something that the GNA could have done to take away some arguments away from Haftar before he showed up. They didn't do it. Regularity of payments of salary is very poor, and all those things basically remained. And on top of it, to add insult to injury, Haftar didn't do as well as what he promised. He has one strength, though, is the Russian banknotes. Sometimes in acute moments of uncertainty or crisis, when he needs to please those constituencies, his silver bullet is to send, packages of Russian banknotes, which basically are not really audited. They just get funneled directly into the LNA from Russia. That is basically the only thing that he has that the GNA doesn't really. The ease with which he sometimes, not always, distributes. In terms of foreign states don't pay armed groups in the Fezzan directly. We probably had a few gifts here and there, and sometimes some promises, but it's not really a business model. And of course, that explains why those groups that are not necessarily, they were not inevitably, doomed to become, devoted to illicit activities, have had to turn to that. And now it has become basically the new normal. So that would be difficult to achieve, because there's this tradition of neglect on the part of the elites. The elites in Libya usually come from the shoreline, and some kind of diplomatic mechanism should be contemplated in terms of guaranteeing that the Fezzan, if there's peace, if there's an opportunity, if there's any kind of window, you would somehow guarantee that a decent portion of the resources are actually funneled into the Fezzan and not stolen by the local elites either. So that is a diplomatic challenge, and it's definitely local. This is not something you see as a diplomat if you're focused on the major, most visible fault line. You have to be local in your approach, and there's a lot of things to be done.
Thank you. I think we'll have time to take one last question. I mean, there are quite a few questions on the motivations of the different actors. So you both already talked about this a bit, but if we can get back to it. So someone is asking, for example, about France's interest. What is France's desired end state in Libya? But we also have questions about motivation of Egypt. Also a question about is Egypt trying to replace Russia? And also quite a lot about the UAE and what is their factors interest in taking from the Libya conflict. So maybe if you can both, I mean, it's quite a big question and we have 5 minutes left. So maybe like the top 3 priority for each each actor, if that's even possible. Maybe Jalel, we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the UAE is not necessarily the biggest, but it's definitely the most stubborn actor historically. And I think, the people who argue that it's deeply interested in the potential of a series of ports that would exist on the coast of Libya, yes, the prestige, making sure that Libya has an economic model that mirrors whatever is preferred by Dubai or Abu Dhabi. All of these things are true, but there's a priority that's higher than all of this, and it's basically the need to decide what kind of ideology is allowed to exist in Tripoli. Because Libya is just too big, too beautifully located, with this huge advantage of having a tiny population, all of them almost Sunni with no sectarian divide. This means that if you're not careful, when you view yourself as the geopolitical overseer of the entire Sunni Arab area, Libya is tremendously important, very prestigious, and whatever ideological message emanates from Tripoli will give ideas to a lot of other countries that are not as well endowed as Libya, but this is from a political science perspective the highest priority from Abu Dhabi's perspective, and France doesn't really, they don't have a vision for Libya. That is outsourced. It's basically France worries about the Sahel. It feels that it's doing it all on its own, that it's not receiving sufficient assistance from its European friends. It's disappointed with the aloofness of the United States, and it keeps looking at this entire part of the world, the 2/3 to the north of, like the 2/3 of the higher part of Africa, as a big region that is basically under its responsibility from a historical and security perspective. And in that context, you want to build the closest partnership with a dynamic, nimble, disciplined state like the UAE. So a lot of what France does is basically help and provide some kind of a diplomatic and political umbrella to whatever the UAE is doing, because they feel that if the UAE would have it its own way, then it would look like a success, and it would be a success that is deeply compatible with whatever France wants to do in the rest of Africa. So it doesn't really have a strategy, it doesn't really have a vision, it doesn't know how to get there, it doesn't have a deep knowledge of the Libyan actors and their own motivations. Egypt is much less aggressive than people imagine. It's very busy with all kinds of other issues. It used to care a lot about ideological messaging, but that was back in 2015, 2017. Now it's a more mature state that really would like to take care of things like the Sinai, the Nile Dam, the economic crisis, the pandemic, and all these things. So it's not necessarily very aggressive when it comes. It was against the offensive on Tripoli. The Egyptians hated the idea. So that was basically my few remarks.
Thanks, Umberto. You have less than 1 minute to give your insights on this.
Yeah, sure. Just a quick point about the question about is Egypt replacing Russia. I don't think so. I think that Egypt is helping Russia, because if we consider neighboring countries and the relations that Russia has, especially with Algeria, I think that Russia is positioning itself as a bridge between one traditional ally like Algeria and one new strategic partner in Egypt. But I also think that Sisi is probably outplaying his ends, especially considering the diffidence of many Eastern tribes to his recent declarations. We must remember that immediately after the independence, the Kingdom of Libya had an uneasy relation with the post-monarchic Egypt, not only due to the considerable influence that the United Kingdom had on the independent Libya, but also because Egypt advanced several territorial claims on its western border with Libya, and the fact that it also advanced a claim on the Jagboub Oasis, which is where the first king, the only one of Libya, this came from, highlights how much sensitive the Libyans are to Egypt's territorial claims.
Thank you, Umberto. So yeah, we've come to the end of this hour. Unfortunately, there are many more questions. I'm really sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I'm sure we'll have more Libya content, so make sure to check the IISS website if you're interested. Thank you to everyone who joined us and for asking interesting questions. And thank you, of course, to both our speakers. It was great, very interesting. And yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day. Thank you.